C.S. Lewis, Letters to Malcolm, chiefly on prayer. Chapter 3. Oh, for mercy's sake, not you too. Why, just because I raise an objection to your parallel between prayer and a man making love to his own wife, must you trot out all of the rigmarole about the holiness of sex and start lecturing me as if I were a Manichaean? I know that in most circles nowadays one need only mention sex to set everyone in the room emitting this gas, but I did hope, not you. Didn't I make it plain that I objected to your image solely on the ground of its nonchalance and presumption? I'm not saying anything against or for sex. Sex in itself cannot be moral or immoral any more than gravitation or nutrition. The sexual behaviour of human beings can, and like their economic or political or agricultural or parental or filial behaviour, it is sometimes good and sometimes bad. And the sexual act, when lawful, which means chiefly when consistent with good faith and charity, can, like all other merely natural acts, whether we eat or drink, etc., as the Apostle says, be done to the glory of God, and will then be holy. And like other natural acts, it is sometimes to be done and sometimes not. This may be what the poor Bishop of Woolwich was trying to say. Anyway, what more is there to be said? And can we now get this red herring out of the way? I'd be glad if we could, for the moderns have achieved the feat which I should have thought impossible, of making the whole subject a bore. Poor Aphrodite. They have sandpapered most of the Homeric laughter off her face. Apparently I have been myself guilty of introducing another red herring by mentioning devotions to the saints. I didn't in the least want to go off into a discussion on that subject. There is clearly a theological defence for it, if you can ask for the prayers of the living. Why should you not ask for the prayers of the dead? There's clearly also a great danger in some popular practice. We see it leading off into an infinitely silly picture of heaven as an earthly court where applicants will be wise to pull the right wires, discover the best channels, and attach themselves to the most influential pressure groups. But I have nothing to do with all of this. I am not thinking of adopting the practice myself, and who am I to judge the practices of others? I only hope there'll be no scheme for canonisations of the Church of England. Can you imagine a better hotbed for yet more divisions between us? The consoling thing is that while Christendom is divided about the rationality and even the lawfulness of praying to the saints, we are all agreed about praying with them, with angels and archangels and all the company. And all the company of heaven. Will you believe it is only quite recently I made the quotation a part of my private prayers. I festoon it round, hallowed be thy name. This, by the way, illustrates that I am saying last week, what I was saying last week about the uses of ready-made forms. They remind one, and I have found this quotation a great enrichment. One always accepted this with theoretically, but it is quite different when one brings it to into consciousness at an appropriate moment and wills the association of one's own little twitter with the voice of the great saints, and we hope of our own dear dead. They may drown some of the uglier qualities and set off any tiny value it has. You may say that the distinction between the communion of the saints, as I find it in the Act, and full-fledged prayers to saints is not after all very great. All the better, if so. I sometimes have a bright dream of reunion engulfing us unawares, like a great wave from behind our backs, perhaps at the moment when our official representatives are still pronouncing it impossible. Discussions usually separate us, actions sometimes unite us. When I spoke of prayer without words, I don't think I meant anything so exalted as the mystics called prayer, the prayer of silence. And when I spoke of being at the top of one's form, I didn't mean it purely in the spiritual sense. The condition of the body comes in, for I suppose a man may be in a state of grace and yet very sleepy. And talking of sleepiness, I entirely agree with you that no one in his senses, if he has any power of ordering his own day, would reserve his chief prayers for bedtime, obviously the worst possible hour for any action which needs concentration. The trouble is that thousands of unfortunate people can hardly find any other, even for us, who are the lucky ones. It is not easy. My own plan, when hard pressed, is to seize any time, the place, however unsuitable, in preference to the last waking moment. On a day of travelling, with perhaps some ghastly meeting at the end of it, I'd rather pray sitting in crowded trains than put it off until midnight, when one reaches a hotel room with aching head and dry throat, and one's mind partly in stupor and partly in a whirl. On other, and slightly less crowded days, a bench in a park or a back street where one can pace up and down will do. A man to whom I was explaining this said, "But why don't you turn into a church?" Partly because for 9 months of the year it will be freezingly cold, but also because I have bad luck in churches. No sooner do I enter one and compose my mind than one or other of two things happen. Either someone starts practising the organ, or else, with resolute tread, there appears from nowhere a pious woman in elastic-side boots, carrying mop, bucket and dustpan, and begins beating hassocks and rolling up carpets and doing things to flower vases. Of course, blessings on her way, work is prayer, and her enacted oratio is probably worth 10 times my spoken one, but it doesn't help mine to become worth more. When one prays in strange places and at strange times, one can't kneel, to be sure. I won't say this doesn't matter. The body ought to pray as well as the soul. Body and soul are both better for it. Bless the body. Mine has led me into many scrapes, but I've led it into far more. I have. If the imagination were obedient, the appetites would give us very little trouble. And from how much it has saved me. And but for our body, one whole realm of God's glory, all that we receive through the senses, would go unpraised. But the beasts can't appreciate it, and the angels are, I suppose, pure intelligences. They understand colours and tastes better than our greatest scientists. But have they retinas or palates? I fancy the beauties of nature are a secret God has shared with us alone. That may be one of the reasons why we were made, and why the resurrection of the body is an important doctrine. But I am being led into digression, perhaps because I am still smarting under the charge of being a Manichee. The relevant point is that kneeling does matter. But other things matter even more. A concentrated mind and a sitting body makes for better prayer than a kneeling body, and a mind half asleep. Sometimes these are the only alternatives. Since the osteoporosis, I can hardly kneel at all in most places myself. A clergyman once said to me that a railway compartment, if one has it to himself, is an extremely good place to pray in because there is just the right amount of distraction. When I asked him to explain, he said that perfect silence and solitude left one more open to the distractions which come from within, and that a moderate amount of external distraction was easier to cope with. I don't find this so myself, but I can imagine it. The Jones boy, named Cyril, though why you find it so important to pray for people by their Christian names, I can't imagine. I always assume God knows their surnames as well. I'm afraid many people appear in my prayers only as that old man at Crewe, or the waitress, or even that man. One may have lost or may never have known their names, and yet remember how badly they needed to be prayed for. No letter next week. I shall be in the thick of exams.